Greetings, steadfast Herle Burlyites. Here's an interesting tidbit. I just added up how many video conferences, webinars, and FaceTimes I've been part of since this whole COVID thing started. The number is way over 1,000, and that doesn't even count the time I spend in Spartacus versus Gladiator chat rooms. The point is, this pandemic has brought the importance of digital connectivity in how we live every aspect of our lives into really sharp focus. Our presenting sponsor, Telus, is working to support that, leveraging their technology and resources to help keep us all connected for good. In fact, they've stepped it up during the pandemic. Their Internet for Good program was originally set up in 2016 to offer more than 200,000 low-income Canadians access to low-cost, subsidized, high-speed internet and a computer. During COVID, Telus expanded the program by providing 2 months free internet access to those families. They also launched the Internet for Good for students, offering low-cost, high-speed internet to support learning at home, kindergarten to grade 12. Free wireless service has been extended to our frontline workers in major COVID-impacted hospitals across Canada. And in BC and Alberta, Internet for Good is now available to almost 200,000 Canadians living with disabilities, so they can access the vital resources and tools they need to live their lives. To read some truly remarkable stories and learn about how TELUS supports our most vulnerable Canadians, go to connectingcanadaforgood.ca. All right, let's get to the Herle Burly in our two-part pod today. For part one, we've got Kevin Carmichael here in the Zoom box to chat with us. Kevin is the National Business Columnist at the Financial Post and a senior fellow at the Centre for International Governance Innovation. One of Canada's leading business journalists, he's taking a little time off from what must be an exhausting family vacation somewhere high in the French Alps. We're going to take a deep dive into the COVID economy and the post-COVID economy for the next 45 minutes or so. For part two, we'll bring on our political panel. This week, we've got the ever-brilliant, ever-resourceful, always able to take a media hit, even when it's from the front seat of her car, Jenni Byrne. Joining Jenni this week is a big catch for us, former Conservative MP, Cabinet Minister, and one of the founders of the Conservative Party of Canada. James Moore is with us from Vancouver. We're going to talk about what else. The Conservative leadership race that threatened to go on forever has mercifully come to an end. How did Erin O'Toole win, and what do the next few months look like for him? Is there going to be a fall election, hot on the heels of prorogation? We've got a new finance minister since last week's episode. We'll chat about Chrystia Freeland adding that job to her portfolio. If we still have time, we'll get to the convention wars south of the border. Last night was the first night of the Republican National Committee, and we may do some yelling on this show just in tribute to that. We'll contrast that with last week's Democratic convention. In the meantime, though, Kevin Carmichael, thank you for making some vacation time for us here on the Herle Burly.
Sure, David, and technically a working vacation so far. So it's sort of within the job description to carve out some time for people like you.
Excellent. So what are you covering in the French Alps? What are the business issues going on?
Business issues are me drowning excellent bottles of wine with my father-in-law. That's like sort of business number one. And then business number two is paying a little bit of attention on what's going on back home. We got some policy oriented features we want to get out towards the end of the week. So that's the focus.
Interesting. The Alps. I've never been. It never even occurred to me that I would go. To me, that's a place that happens in the movies where people hide from Nazis, or where Nazis hide, or where James Bond skis away from villains, or something.
Indeed.
Yeah.
No, I come to hide and as I said, drink good wine with my father-in-law. So I suppose I'm hiding from maybe not Nazis, but everybody else.
Yeah, good wine makes a difference everywhere. So let's talk about the economy.
Sure.
And it's your job to cover it. It's your job to have sort of an overview of what's going on. What are you paying attention to right now in the Canadian economy? What's on your mind right now?
So here's what's on my mind. I mean, I just sort of pulling various strands together. I mean, it seems to me that the consensus that we seem to have in Canada over economic policy over the last 2 or 3 decades, sort of wrapped around the idea essentially of sort of a wide embrace of free trade, monetary policy that revolves around targeting inflation of 2%, and then of course balanced budgets. Those three things to me sort of symbolize, I guess, or encapsulate Canadian economic policy, or the economic policy consensus that we seem to achieve politically. There wasn't a lot of debate about it. There's lots of debate on the margins, I suppose, but at its core, we were okay with that, and as a result, it seems like we had a pretty good run. So I think you could argue sort of say mid-90s up through the eve of the Great Recession, things were going okay. But I think what we've seen since is that consensus, well, the consensus might still exist to a certain degree, but I think we see that the consensus is just wrong for the times that we're in. I think we went back in time 30 years. Would we embrace sort of globalization or the WTO the way that we did back in the 90s? I don't know that we would. Is it an inflation target the right form of monetary policy? It might be, but would we want such a strict view around that sort of that 2% bullseye that we sort of embraced for the last couple of decades? And then, of course, the fiscal policy, that sort of that religion of the balanced budget that David, I guess you had a certain role in helping to lift off the ground. I mean, that certainly was right for the time, was certainly right for the moment, but I don't know that it served us well sort of heading into the Great Recession. It's not to say that would favor throwing any sort of fiscal sustainability out the window, but maybe we could have, if we had a more flexible sort of idea of what fiscal sustainability was, maybe we would have had a health system, say, that would have been better set up to handle the pandemic, for example. Maybe our seniors would have been dying by the dozens and hundreds if we had sort of had instead of a tough sort of balanced budget objective, maybe if we had an objective of a deficit of, say, 2% of GDP or 3% of GDP, maybe that would have brought some more flexibility, that we could have sort of at least financed an elder care system that wouldn't have killed so many people through the crisis. So those are the sorts of things I'm thinking about. I'm actually kind of excited by Erin O'Toole's win. It suggests to me there's the possibility for something of an actual economic policy debate going forward, which is one I think we badly need.
So some indicators are coming back more strongly than others. Some indicators are coming back more strongly than expected. We've been talking on this show about the politics of the next year as if the economy is going to be really rough in Canada over the next year, that we're going to be in a pretty tough recession. Is that your expectation?
I'm not going to call it an expectation. I'm going to try to stay away from the expectation game because honestly, I don't know, and I don't think anybody really knows. I think what we can say with a certain amount of confidence is that it would be foolish to expect sort of a quick return to the way things were sort of pre-COVID. That's obviously not going to happen. There's going to be some destruction that's occurred that wasn't sort of saved by the massive amount of money that the governments and central banks have pumped into the system. So what that means is, at best, probably a slow climb back to where we were. So that's sort of what I see. But we don't really know yet. We don't have enough information, because what we've done to this point is, and it was the right thing, we put all kinds of foam on the runway. So the airplane didn't crash. It wasn't a terrible disaster. But we don't know yet, perhaps because, if you want to stick with the airplane analogy, because of the smoke and burnt rubber and all that, we don't know quite what damage was left behind. So we don't know how many companies are going to be left, say, 6 months from now, to sort of be around, be sitting there to take advantage of sort of the return to a more normal economy. We don't know how many people are going to get stranded, basically, by sort of this shift to a digital economy that's been sped up by this. So, there could be people who had comfortable jobs or were quite comfortable heading into this crisis, but because companies are obviously going to advance their shift to a digital economy, maybe a large group of people will get left behind. We don't know that yet. So I think the right kind of policy obviously is to hedge, right? We don't assume that we're going to catapult out of this, and we probably want to be thinking about the sort of policies that much like we reacted quickly, or much like governments reacted relatively quickly to try to put a floor under the potential damage. We want to be thinking about the sorts of policies that would be needed to pick up the people that could be left behind, the companies that could be left behind, and that we can anticipate, I think.
Well, I guess the reason I asked you about the state of the economy is because I do want to get back to your fiscal anchor question. But it seems important to understand how much stimulus we're expecting the economy to continue to need on a going forward basis to assess that. But, just as a starter on the fiscal anchor thing, I've had economists on here a month and a half ago who wouldn't answer that question, didn't feel capable of answering the question of what the fiscal anchor ought to be. Don Drummond, who I worked with when Paul was the Minister of Finance, and Don was a very senior member of the finance officials, has written and I highly respect him. I think he's a super smart guy, but he's written an open letter to the Prime Minister from the C.D. Howe Institute, I think, pretty much demanding that the government put in place some sort of fiscal anchor. What we mean by a fiscal anchor, let's just be clear about that, is some sort of commitment to what your deficit and debt levels will be allowed to get to, or what your target is for those debt and deficit levels. So that could be a balanced budget, that could be a $20 billion deficit, that could be a debt to GDP ratio, it could be any one of those things. But right now, we don't have that. Nobody knows, and it makes it, in my view, impossible to make choices. And because why wouldn't you have pharmacare? If you can run a $350 billion deficit without any issues, why wouldn't you have pharmacare? Paul was saying to me on the weekend, Kevin, that by God, he wished these monetary rules had been these fiscal and monetary rules had been in place in the mid '90s, and he would have been a very different finance minister. He wouldn't have been cutting. He'd have been, adding childcare and all sorts of Kelowna and all sorts of things onto the mix in 1995, if these rules had been in place. So, what is, previously, we had one spike up to the $70 or $80 billion deficit level in 2008, 2009, and then previous to that, the highest record was in the last year of the Mulroney government at around $42 billion. Now we're in the $350, $400 billion range. Does it even mean anything anymore?
Well, look, I'm going to answer your question quickly and say yes, I think it matters. But now I'm going to have to back up a little bit. And I think context is really important when you're thinking about fiscal policy in my observation over the last number of years. So you talked about your conversation with Minister Martin, the issues that he faced in the 90s, and which are very real, and he definitely did not have the room to maneuver that finance ministers have today, because the rules, as he noted, around monetary policy and the rules of the global bond markets have changed so much. So back in the 90s, you had to worry about bond vigilantes, right? So basically, the bond markets forced the government's hand, and Canada was on the eve of something like a financial crisis of its own, because the international bond markets had essentially lost confidence in Canada's ability to keep up with its debt payments. So you had to send a firm signal to those people to say, okay, look, we're getting a handle on this situation, and you had to do a tough period of austerity. You had to show that you were serious about that by basically adhering to that strict balanced budget rule, and that was in effect the fiscal anchor from that time. The rules are indeed different now, which is why I think you can be more flexible about it. There are no bond vigilantes out there. There's people wonder if they could come roaring back at some point, but there's no real reason to worry about the international bond markets forcing a country like Canada to start worrying about its debt payments. I mean, even with Canada losing sort of that cherished kind of trio of AAA ratings from the big bond rating agencies, I mean, it still stands out as a place where people are going to want to park some money in a time of uncertainty, and that's going to keep downward pressure on interest rates. So there's every reason to think that borrowing costs might not stay as low as they are, but we're not looking at a spike to double digits either. So that's the context in which I think that finance ministers need to be thinking about a physical anchor. But then gets back to your original question. I do think it still matters. I mean, people like Don Drummond and you guys that fought the debt wars of the 90s are maybe more sensitive than maybe the current generation of policymakers whose outlook has maybe been formed by the Great Recession and seen that maybe the rules of monetary policy were different than we thought they were back in the 90s. So maybe somebody like Don is a little too sensitive, but at the same time, I think it would be a mistake to assume that the central banks can basically finance the world's rich economies for the next few decades. So we need something in place to stand out in international financial markets, because there is a lot of debt out there now. So we're going to reach a point where bond traders are going to start to pick and choose their best options. So you want to be among those that look like a good investment. And then I think just for political economy reasons, just for the sort of political stability or the confidence of the populace, you need to. I mean, at least in the context of Canada, I think you need to at least send a message to people that we're not sitting around here waiting to blow our brains out. We have a certain idea of that we can't spend forever, and this is sort of like that speaks to the nature of Canadians. So I think that's another reason why governments probably in the Canadian context want to have something of fiscal anchor, and why I've been puzzled why the Trudeau government hasn't tried harder to put one in place.
So just to be clear on one detail, in the 90s, you talked about these bond traders, and Canada had to go to the financial markets of the world and convince people to buy our debt. Are we not now selling our debt to the Bank of Canada, which is a completely different thing and is more of a circular internal thing, isn't it? I mean, this didn't seem to be an option that was available in the 1990s, that we would sell our debt to the Bank of Canada.
Yeah, you're right. It wasn't an option in the 90s because I guess it certainly wasn't in the textbooks. Certainly nothing that a central banker from that era wanted to do, because it violated that kind of careful construct that they had built for themselves about the way markets work and the way monetary policy works and the way monetary policy can influence an economy. And of course, all that was influenced by the inflation of the 70s and 80s and everything that they'd done to bring that under control. So the assumption was if the central bank started creating money, buying up all the government debt, well, it was just going to bring back the inflation that they'd just spent a decade or so trying to get under control. So that there was nothing anybody wanted to think about at that time. But as the world, as history unfolded and various countries started to find themselves in trouble, when pushed with their backs up against the wall, I mean, the central banks had to dig deeper in the textbooks and theory and give some of these things a try. I mean, when the Fed went all in on quantitative easing, which of course is the catch term for the creation of money to basically buy up debt and put downward pressure on borrowing costs. I mean, everybody thought that was going to be inflationary. It just wasn't. So, in theory, it could be. In theory, it should be. But real life suggests it's not. So, I mean, that's the backdrop we're in. So maybe
a world in which none of the old economic rules apply. A world in which all economic orthodoxy is on its head.
Well, something like that, yeah. I mean, which is why sort of I started off, you asked me what I was thinking about, and that's what I'm thinking about. Like, do we need to update our sort of policy, our economic policy consensus to fit the times? And it's also, so I guess I started thinking about this a little more when Trudeau did his press conference of last week and started talking about, wanting to go big and throw out old ideas and grab hold of new ones. And I think there's some merit in that, but at the same time, what old ideas do we want to chuck out, and what old ideas still have a lot of function in the current context? And I think so. When I talk to people, I think there's an acceptance that even though the rules have changed, but all this really happened is maybe the guideposts have widened a bit, or the parameters have changed. But perhaps the rules of finance, as we understood them in the 90s, still exist, but maybe there's a little more room to maneuver than central bankers realized. So that gets back to your point about the need for a fiscal anchor. I think you want a fiscal anchor if for no other reason to hedge against the possibility that maybe the rules haven't changed. And so maybe we don't want to go all modern monetary theory and create as much money as we think we need to do all the things we want. So I think it comes down to for me, David, like you, as you framed it. It's just we need a framework in which to make some decisions. And I don't think we're at a point yet where we can say that the rules have changed so much that we can do whatever we want. So we need some parameters in which to make some choices. And without a fiscal anchor, I think you're right. We don't have a sort of a playing field on which we can go and have it out and decide what it is we want to do as a country.
So do you think that the current fiscal situation, Kevin, makes redistributive dreams like basic income or pharmacare impossible, or more possible than ever?
So more possible than ever, I guess. But I would like to see that done in the context of the choices that you're talking about. So we certainly could do UBI in Canada if we wanted to, and certainly the new rules of finance, if you want to describe it that way, that we're talking about, create a bit more room to do that sort of thing. But we can't layer a UBI on top of everything we're doing now, I don't think, and nor do most of the people I talk to think. So we could do it if we wanted to overhaul our whole approach to social policy and throw away. So if you wanted to, here's like part of the policy question. Certainly we could do it if you want to get rid of the Canada Child Benefit. But as soon as you start talking about getting rid of the Canada Child Benefit, you run into obviously a political wall, because people love the Canada Child Benefit. High middle income exactly.
People love the child benefit.
Quite right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, exactly. The constituency.
People that aren't going to get a basic income love the child benefit. Okay?
Quite right. No, the India has this great term. They call it vote banks. And so, the most important vote bank for the current government loves the Canada Child Benefit. So it's going to make it very difficult to get rid of that. But that's a cost center, right? So you could use that money to help fund a UBI. But I don't think you can. And I've heard Kevin Milligan's been on your show, and he's quite eloquent about describing how we just can't afford it under our current context. And I guess he's advising the PCO now, right? So maybe they're hearing the same message. But the answer to your question though is we've seen that there's room to do more on social policy if we want to, and the pandemic, the crisis, has shown us, I think, that we should, but we just can't grab all the best ideas from the World Economic Forum's last publication and layer them on top of everything we're doing now. We're going to make some choices.
What do you think Trudeau is talking about?
Well, I don't know. It feels like they'll finally do something on daycare, which I think would be fantastic. And on top of that, obviously there's going to be another effort to go big on climate again, which would be positive too, provided that they're willing to make some choices at the same time, and depending about how they're willing to go about this. But those seem to be most likely. If reading between the lines, I'd be curious what you think about this, David, because I don't have any particular inside information. But if Carney's the puppet master there in Ottawa now, I mean, he's been all about climate change for the last number of years. So if he has any sort of influence, I mean, there's going to be a big push on climate. And then, they seem to have bought into the idea that this recession is being felt most by women, and in particular. And so if you consider who or what women might be most likely to vote for the Trudeau government, well, those sort of working class and upper middle class women who have sort of professional jobs, who have had to try to figure out how to, either run their companies or contribute to their businesses by, at the same time taking care of their kids. So clearly, there would be the answer to that issue, or at least an important answer, would be subsidized daycare. And so when I'm not in France, I'm based in Montreal, and you can see the difference that a properly subsidized daycare system makes to an economy. I mean, the numbers that Quebec has basically gone from a basket case to one of the better, more dynamic economies in the country in the span of a couple of decades, and that has a lot to do with their decision to subsidize daycare. It just crowds more talented people into the economy. It really lets.
So when they brought in their subsidized childcare plan, and it was what, $5 a day when they brought it in?
Yeah,
or $10 a day.
Raised it a bit. They had $5 at first, and then they couldn't quite manage that, so I think they raised it a bit over the years, but it's still entirely important.
So all the orthodox economists said that was crazy, that was unaffordable, that was a bizarrely generous plan. But as you said, it's paid for itself in spades, right? In economic activity.
Totally. It absolutely has. I mean, it's. I don't think there's any argument against it anymore. And I mean, you're right. The orthodox economists didn't like it, and maybe some of them still don't. But the value of it is we had a sort of a natural experiment with Ontario next to Quebec, and seeing what happened in those two economies over that 2-3 decade span. And Quebec caught up to the point that it can now borrow more cheaply in bond markets than Ontario. And when I started doing this work back in the late 80s, early 90s, nobody would have believed that Quebec could ever have more confidence of international bond traders, just as was one example than Ontario. I mean, Ontario was the standard for economics and economic policy in Canada, and that's no longer necessarily the case. I mean, Quebec has done a lot of really good things, and number one is the sort of embrace of subsidized daycare.
So that's interesting because that has always been largely sold to Canadians as a social policy, not an economic policy. But in the aftermath of COVID, so many people were talking about the disproportionate impact of COVID on women in the workforce and on the sectors in which women predominate, and that we couldn't really get back to economic growth levels unless we found a way to get those women back into the workforce and take care of their kids for them. So in recent months, it's been talked about more as an economic growth policy. What do you think the elements of a real growth strategy for Canada would be right now? Because we can't just focus on the redistributive side of things. We do have an actual huge economic slowdown in Canada globally. Things seem to have changed in terms of, it feels to me like the pendulum on trade is swinging back a little bit. Maybe the commitment globally to free trade is not the same as it was. So that's something that we're going to have to bear in mind. So again, there's all these different rules about the economy. What should Canada be doing? What should Freeland be doing in the budget to kickstart economic growth and competitiveness here in Canada?
For sure. No, I think so it depends on the time frame. So I mean, we just we'll maybe square off the discussion around daycare. I mean, I think that's absolutely fundamentally sound and good policy for Canada, sort of in the medium term. I think to think of it as a recovery. If we're talking about a recovery, if we assume the economy needed a kickstart, I don't think we can assume that the capacity is there to simply come out with a subsidized daycare plan particularly given that daycare is basically still is governed by the provinces. So I can't assume that a subsidized daycare plan is going to give you that kickstart necessarily. It's the right thing to do for the long-term competitiveness and productivity of the Canadian economy. If we want to, like I see Erin O'Toole would like to get us back to growth rates closer to 3%. I mean, if we want to do that, then we need a subsidized daycare program. But that would help immensely over the medium term and obviously over the longer term, like we saw with Quebec. But it's not going to necessarily give you a kickstart because, especially given social distancing and all those sorts of restrictions, I just don't think there are going to be enough daycares there to allow parents just to send their kids back to some sort of a care program immediately. So I think something we need to do to make sure that that we get that kickstart is to make sure that we don't lose companies. I mean, that's what happened during the Great Recession, is that there was assumption that trade would sort of bring the Canadian economy back like it always had. We just need to be patient, and we would catch that upswing that came with the global recovery. So the upswing came, but exports and business investment didn't come back the way, not nearly as quickly as anybody anticipated, and never really got back to where you thought they would have been. And one of the reasons for that was that just too many companies were wiped out during the recession. So there wasn't anybody there to take advantage of that upswing in global demand when it came. So that was like ultimately the economists would call it, or talk about it like as a blow to capacity. So Canada's capacity to generate wealth actually, kind of semi-permanently shrunk because of the Great Recession and because of all the things that happened during that period. That's a lesson that we should take from a decade ago and make sure that we're doing what we can to keep certainly the companies that have a chance to grab sort of the upsurge in global economic activity, that these sorts of companies are alive when that happens. And I think based on what we're seeing, we need to we need to be hyper focused on ensuring that sort of those companies that are already digitally native have business plans and are viably building toward being sort of world beaters in a digital economy. I mean, we need to make sure that these companies, one, stay afloat, but two, there are things we could do to give them a bit of a nudge, to give them a bit of a boost into this digital economy that's coming. And I think probably if we're talking about a kickstart, I think what you want to see is some sort of reorientation of procurement policy to have it, instead of trying to save money, instead of being very cautious to assume we don't make mistakes, what you want to do is a procurement policy that is sort of, has those things in the background, but is also like moves to the front of the list of priorities, giving a chance to emerging Canadian companies to give
probably
them
means
that,
we wouldn't sub out the security of our embassies to a Chinese company if we did that, probably.
Well, that's exactly the kind of thing. I mean, of course you wouldn't do that sort of thing. And the reason you can get away with it now, I mean, I think we stayed away from it because we basically speaking, we Canadians want to play by the rules of the game fairly. So we might bend some rules, but for the most part, we want to be true to the sort of the agreements that we sign on to. So you know, David, that for decades we've fought against Buy America policies, and without really doing it ourselves. Well, right. While we were sort of making the noble stand against the abuse of procurement or skewing procurement toward local industries, local companies, that sort of thing. Well, the rest of the world was doing it. So, I think given the fact that, the economic backdrop is changing, we're at a moment where, the next great companies, and we're talking about thousands and thousands of the next great companies are going to emerge, those that know how to operate well in a digital environment, and you should probably add climate change to that mix. So those companies that stand a chance to grow and grow quickly by seizing on these opportunities are the sorts that every country is trying to nurture at this time. And I don't think, I think Canada needs to throw away, some of its old ideas about trade. So this is where I may side with the Prime Minister if he was willing to check out some of our old notions about how the global economy works and how trade agreements work, and start to skew some of these procurement policies towards Canadian companies. I think that would be maybe the best thing that they could do to kickstart us into the recovery.
Are you worried about the potential, given how weak many companies are right now, many businesses are right now, about the potential for even further consolidation in sectors? This was happening before COVID, but I presume as a result of COVID, Walmart and Amazon, companies that had the deep pockets to survive what was going on and didn't have to, and were online distributors, so didn't have to worry about being closed. I presume that they are moving through our retail sector like a hot knife through butter right now.
Sure they are. And the reason you can tell they are is because, for example, our grocery oligopoly tried to make much hay of the threat that Amazon and Walmart posed to their business model when they were at the what do they call it now? The used to be industry back in our day, David, but innovation committee or whatever it is. That group of parliamentarians that would have certain role to oversee antitrust issues and that sort of thing. Anyway, absolutely, it's an issue. I think it's an issue for Canada on both ends of this discussion. I think. I mean, we're being, to my observation, being held back by these oligopolies that we've allowed to build up, these legacy oligopolies like in banking and telecommunications, and grocery is now sort of come to the fore given the issues around the COVID crisis. So I think it's giving us an opportunity to see all the reasons that we read in the textbooks that we shouldn't like cartels and oligopolies because of what they do to competition and how they skew markets and all that sort of thing. So that's an anchor, and then at the other end, there's certainly a risk. Well,
let me just say to how, like on the grocery side. So when they withdrew their emergency pay bump so early, and in fact withdrew it at all, rather than just saying these people deserve to make $16 an hour rather than $14 an hour. I was outraged, and I wanted to register that outrage as a consumer. But since the three companies that own every grocery store in Canada had all jointly agreed on the wage policy, there was literally no way as a consumer for me to register my displeasure with that decision. There was no place I could go to buy groceries that wasn't owned by one of those companies that had enacted that wage policy in concert with each other.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. That's too often the case for too many people. Given where I live in Montreal, I was able to exercise that protest vote because I have a couple of independent grocers sort of around the corner. Of course, I pay a lot more money when I go to shop there, but I just couldn't stand it anymore. Observing just sort of what that system, and the companies themselves are not necessarily malicious. Here was my issue with, I did have an issue with the way that sort of grocer debate was framed, and that they were, they were colluding. They weren't necessarily colluding, certainly in the legal sense, which I suppose is why they had the lawyers on the phone for all the conversations. So they weren't doing anything illegal, but they were behaving like an oligopoly, David. They were just, they know how to read off each other, and we know how these groups operate. Like there's an alpha among the group, and I think in the case of the grocers, it's evidence might show that it's essentially Loblaw, as you would expect. It's the biggest. So when Loblaw decides, that's why that the courtesy email to all the others is so obnoxious in a way, because that's just the tilt of the head to say, okay, we're going, guys, so follow along, or if you want to.
Right.
Of course they want to, because that's how they've decided to run their particular industry, instead of like trying to aggressively gain market share by doing things like, we talk in the grocery space, we talk about price all the time, but there are theoretically other things you could do than try to compete on price. You could compete on quality. You could compete on trying to provide the best service, which would entail maybe having a higher wage rate than your competitor to coax the best people into your stores rather than just keep everything the same. But that's not the kind of competition that we get in the oligopolistic industries that have grown up in Canada. Instead, we've got a group of companies that just basically have decided to carve out defined space amongst amongst themselves, rather than have the sort of competition that would do things like, well, naturally lower prices, raise wage rates, and provide better service, that sort of thing. At least we just don't have that. And unfortunately, these oligopolies are pretty fundamental industries. Like, these are foundations to anybody's economy. And unfortunately, in Canada, we've got a foundation that is not not helping us be competitive, not providing the sort of productivity and innovation that you see in other parts of the world.
So let's just pick up on this, take this to a slightly different place, which is, before COVID happened, there was already some high-level talk in the business community at places like Davos and among leaders like Larry Fink about the need for business to change its perspective from a pure shareholder value as measured by quarterly results perspective, and to what in business they call a shared value approach, in which businesses take into account what their impact is on the community and a broader set of metrics than just quarterly shareholder value. So this spirit was supposed to be starting to animate the business community pre-COVID. Coming out of COVID, what is your sense of the attitude of, I think we're talking about large business when we talk about this. What is your sense of where the business community is at about its role in society? Hunker down and survive and make money, or we need to be better people?
I think overall that movement, if we can call it that, that was starting to pick up some steam before the crisis, continues. Certainly in the sort of international investing space, so the people who are driving financial markets, ultimately deciding where to put all our savings. They believe it, so they're going to force a bit of change. But I think the grocery example, to come back to it, shows that, that's hardly universal, and that there's still going to remain a certain attempt to hide behind some publicity around this movement, make it sound like you're trying to communicate and you care more about your stakeholders. But we saw, like, again, the grocery example is such a great one, because we had it sort of was sparked by Galen Weston Jr. I mean, one of the richest people in the world, never mind in Canada, going on at length in a note to his clients, to the shoppers of Loblaw and Shoppers and all those other brands that he owns, talking about how he was with them, felt their pain through the crisis and all of this. And then, in the last two paragraphs, he basically gave a vote of confidence for minimum wage, gave a vote of confidence for UBI or something like a UBI, and said, "Oh, by the way, we're taking back the bonus pay." Well, right. I mean, what is that? What one of the world's richest people and one of Canada's most successful companies is saying there is he wants taxpayers, he wants the rest of us to subsidize a living wage, or the wage that he pays his employees. And I mean, that's the great example to me about how capitalism is sort of broken down, at least in the Canadian context, because Galen Weston Jr. has all the power in the world to raise the living wage if he wants to. He's the biggest private sector employer in the country. If he decided that he wanted to pay his workers $15 an hour instead of $13, or whatever the wage might be, because of those oligopolistic dynamics that we were talking about earlier, the rest of them would have to follow along. They would follow along. So he has all kinds of power on his own to do something about a living wage. But for whatever it is, whatever the mentality or calculations that are made inside those boardrooms, they're just not willing to do it. They want to do it. It's the banks do the same thing. I mean, they will put us at risk of a housing meltdown, and then in their price wars over mortgage rates or what have you, and then kind of at the same time beg the government to stop them from destroying themselves. They don't have it within themselves to do it on their own. So I mean, we talked about the Prime Minister's sort of willingness to get rid of some old ways of thinking. I mean, there are some old ways of thinking that definitely need to be thrown out, and another one of them is our sort of soft glove approach to these oligopolies and kind of a weak commitment to antitrust laws. I mean, we need to toughen those up. And Nate Erskine-Smith, the Liberal MP, maybe the one Liberal MP who has the courage to kind of speak his own mind rather than that of the hive mind that seems to dominate policy from that government. I mean, he says he's going to stick at this. He's the one that brought the grocery CEOs to the committee, and he's sort of sent some shots across the bow. And if they don't change, then he said he's going to go to his cabinet colleagues and push for a tougher approach to antitrust. So I mean, I hope he does it.
Yeah, I was quite surprised when Kathleen Wynne was raising the minimum wage in Ontario. I was quite surprised that the owner of No Frills was opposed to that. Yeah, exactly. But remember, when Wynne was going to break the Ontario economy, right? The minimum wage spike, and oh my God, you couldn't. Hundreds of thousands of lost jobs. Hundreds of thousands of lost jobs.
Nothing happened. The economy was stronger. So I mean, we just have to. These are old, like these worries about what the minimum wage are going to do to business. I mean, they find a way. So yeah, nobody wants to pay more for anything. It's like the corollary of a taxpayer complaining about higher taxes. Well, taxes go up a little bit, and we figure out a way to manage. Companies figure out a way to manage. Sure. So if you were to raise wage raises in the grocery business, chances are that would put some upward pressure on the price of food. But maybe if you broke down some of the oligopolies in telecommunications and banking, prices might come down. So you'd be able to balance that out, and it wouldn't cost us anything. It would just maybe adding some or beefing up the Competition Bureau and sending it off to do its job properly. But it's certainly not going to cost as much as another big sort of infrastructure program or these sorts of things that we think we need to do to boost productivity and competitiveness. We could just enforce some of the antitrust laws that we already have in place. We'd do a lot for competitiveness.
Erin O'Toole spoke with the Prime Minister yesterday, and high on his agenda was Western alienation, feelings in Alberta and Saskatchewan. In this new post-COVID economy, if the government needs to have a big plan for the economy, what role does the oil and gas sector play in that future economy for Canada?
I think the oil and gas industry probably plays a more important role than a lot of Liberals think. And I look at it like this. I mean, there's still a big generator of wealth. And so when conservatives make the point that there's going to be, I think they overstate it, but there's still runway for oil and gas. There's still demand for oil and gas for at least another couple of decades. And I suppose conservatives and those in the oil and gas industry would argue longer than that. And that's all true. So what we need to do, and I guess this is kind of what the Prime Minister is always said he wants to do, is sort of use that money essentially to kind of pivot to a net zero economy. I think that's right. I think that's the right thing to do. But what we need to do in the meantime, though, is I think we need a little more evidence that those big oil and gas companies are in fact doing that they're serious about it. And out in Alberta, I think we really need some sort of a clue that they're taking climate change seriously. And I listened to the podcast a lot, David, and I'm pretty sure it was you and Scott who told me not to bother paying attention to O'Toole's policy program, because anybody that has to put a policy program on the table is as much as lost. So I have to admit,
That must have been Reed.
Up to it.
That must have been Reed.
I think it was. But I think Scott maybe agreed with you 100%. Anyway. So I'm catching up with Erin O'Toole's policy program over the last 24 hours or so. And, there's still not enough there when it comes to climate change. There's like the I guess that, the centerpiece demand of scrapping the carbon tax. I mean, I guess if that's what voters really want, but there's a pretty broad and deep consensus that that's exactly the sort of policy you need to if you.
Is there really? Can I just jump on that for a second? Sure. Is there really, like, what is the actual point of the carbon tax we have at this level?
Well, I mean, is it
really changing? Is it really changing any behavior?
No, of course not, because it's not high enough.
Right.
I mean, so the issue I guess I have with the conservative approach, and I'll echo Erin O'Toole's policy program, since I sort of top of mind since I just read it. They want to basically assume that those of us on the ground have no role in this fight. That it's something that big companies, the oil producers themselves, need to do. So we'll tax them, but we won't tax you. Well, I mean, that just defies logic. I mean, voters are smarter than that. They know that if the company itself, or the producer of that oil and gas, or that gasoline that you're putting in your vehicle is facing higher costs, then your costs are going to go up with it. One, two. I mean, why shouldn't the entire society take some piece of this fight, right? If that's what it is, if it really is sort of an existential crisis and
right.
A war on ensuring this planet remains livable, then why shouldn't everybody play a role in that? And so that to me is why the carbon tax is functional. Now, the Liberals have been, to me, almost as guilty, or even arguably equally as guilty, because they've wanted to say, yeah, carbon tax is the right way to go, but but not a carbon tax that actually you're going to feel. So right, so we're not
right.
So that's basically, so that's why the Conservatives in some way are kind of right when they say that that Trudeau's carbon tax is not a climate policy, it's a tax policy, because that's all it's doing right now. It's just sort of moving money around. It's like you're taking money out of people's pocket at the gas pumps and then sending it back to them, and doing almost nothing to change carbon emissions. I think just to wrap this up quickly, I will say that the biggest oil and gas companies out in Alberta are probably doing a lot more than we realize, because we kind of lose sight of what they're doing behind all the noise that comes from the Alberta government and some of the others that are so opposed to taking some serious steps to do something about climate change. So I think there must be some common ground. If you have the biggest producers in Alberta sort of buying into net zero, there must be a way to bring that sort of conservative outlook and the liberal outlook together to do something that actually might make a difference. And maybe this is what you'll see in Trudeau's throne speech, particularly if, as we said, Carney's behind it. You might see some more aggressive policy along this line that might, though, echo what progressive, if I can put it that way, energy companies are doing, because certainly that's where Carney would have been spending most of his time. And that message just hasn't come through in Canada for some reason. I think we've let the politicians take that debate over and lost sight of the fact that, companies that want to remain a going concern are, in fact, taking this issue at least somewhat seriously. If maybe we could argue whether they're taking it as seriously as they should be, but the big producers are certainly putting some plans in place to get to net zero on the same timeline as Canada. So we can't really accuse them of dragging their feet. They've adopted the same timetable as the politicians have.
So you've been through Erin. I don't want to waste your time having gone so carefully through Erin O'Toole's platform. Based on that platform, what is the policy debate you're looking forward to? You said at the very beginning of this, I'm looking forward to finally having an economic debate in the country now that we have a new conservative leader. What debate are you looking forward to?
Yeah, well, I mean, going through O'Toole's policy program, it just sort of occurred to me, like, I don't know if we're going to get like something like the great free trade debate of '88 again, but we've got two approaches now. I mean, two approaches assuming that the Trudeau throne speech looks like we basically assume it's going to look. So more of a redistribution being the focus rather than wealth creation. Well, O'Toole's ideas are really more about wealth creation. And so, I mean, so I see the potential there. So I will preface this by saying every time, this sort of like economics policy guy starts to get into a political debate, he's told by experts like you, David, how full of shit he is by assuming that voters are going to make any sort of decision around policy. But anyway, we do have different approaches. We have redistribution versus wealth creation. I think it's the kind of debate we have to have, because I mean the redistribution idea is fine, but the idea itself seems to me to be more is like a sort of an import from the U.S., more of an import from the ideas sort of that make the rounds in the Democratic Party. And those ideas are obviously needed in the U.S., where there's extreme income inequality and real societal fissures. And so that's an economy that has no trouble generating wealth. It has a real problem with making sure everybody gets to have a piece of that wealth. I don't know that we have that same problem, certainly in that degree in Canada, but we do have a serious problem about wealth creation. It gets back to the antitrust issues we were talking about. We don't trade freely between provinces. I mean, just all these dumb things that just make it that much harder for entrepreneurs to get their companies off the ground. So, I mean, I think that's the approach that I would take, or that's the end or that's how I would first come at trying to address all these issues that we're worrying about in Canada. And I mean, not to pick sides, but some of O'Toole's ideas are the sorts of things that at least the people in the business community have been talking about for years, that they sort of need to be more competitive. He has some more aggressive ideas on doing something about interprovincial free trade. He talked about a tax overhaul, which is extremely important. The tax system is a mess. It doesn't have anything to do with a modern economy. It really needs to be looked at hard and reworked to match business the way business is done in a digital economy. So these are easy things to do, but for whatever reason, the political class just hasn't, kind of might talk about them once in a while, but refuses to attack them. So, if Trudeau's promising to go big, maybe O'Toole has to go big too, and maybe we get a clash. And some sort of a new consensus around the sort of economic policies we want in Canada.
Well, in a time with no rules, there should be lots of scope for a vigorous debate, right, about ideas. Nobody's really constrained by any orthodoxy right now.
As you observed earlier, I mean, the old rules in so many instances no longer apply. Free trade rules are out the window. Monetary policy rules clearly have no real connection in the world we're living in now. And then, fiscal policy. I mean, balanced budgets, man. That's an anachronism suddenly. I mean, I'm gonna have to change
my entire biography.
Exactly, David. It's not going to look so good on your CV anymore.
Balance the budget. What was he talking about?
Why? Should have just told the central bank to finance it for you.
The last thing, and perhaps most importantly to me, is at the end of the day, how are you feeling about the Habs?
I mean, I'm a Oilers and Capitals fan, so
Come on, you're living in Montreal.
I am, but I grew up when Gretzky was doing his thing, and so I sort of latched onto the Oilers, and then I lived in D.C. for a while. In fact, I moved the same year that Ovechkin showed up, and it was a joy to, after spending a while in Ottawa and basically having to take a day off to get to the rink to see a game on time, to be able 10 minutes stroll down to the rink downtown and watch Alex Ovechkin as a rookie in a half full building. It was a joy. So yeah, I kind of became a Capitals fan at the same time. So anyway, point is, so I've just basically said that I don't really feel like talking about hockey, David. So let's move on.
That's right. It was a tough spring for you then. Absolutely.
Tough COVID, tough bubble tournament for my teams, that's for sure.
Okay. All right. Listen, thank you for your time this morning. This was fantastic. You better go off and hide from the Nazis before they find you.
I will. Thanks, David.
Somebody once told me that there are no Swiss. That if somebody tells you that they're Swiss, they're a Nazi. So just be.
Really? I think there's probably some people around here that probably would agree with that. They don't love the Swiss of this part of the world.
Be careful. Great talking with you, Kevin. Thanks a lot.
Great talking with you too, David. Thanks.
If we've learned anything over the past few weeks, it's that in times of crisis, governments matter. So if you've never heard of Queen's Park Today, it's one of Ontario's most trusted news sources for political insiders and for people who actually need to know what is happening at the legislature every day. Whether it affects your business, your stakeholders, or the health and safety of your family, Queen's Park Today is tracking the ongoing developments in Ontario. The newsletter lands in your inbox first thing every morning, so you can start your day off already ahead of the game. During a crisis, the importance of governments increases dramatically. The only way to really get the detailed boots-on-the-ground coverage you need is by subscribing to Queen's Park Today. There's also BC Today and Alberta Today, which are great for people who want to know what's going on out west, but don't have the time to follow it closely. To get a free 2-week trial of Queen's Park Today, BC Today, or Alberta Today, go to politicstoday.news and hit the free trial button. That's politicstoday.news/free trial. All right, panel. Jenni, say hi.
Hello.
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing?
Good. I'm all right. You look fantastic, I must say.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're joined today by James Moore, up super early in Vancouver to be part of this panel discussion with us today. Thanks for coming, Minister. This is great to have you on.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I'm so happy. James and I have been friends for what seems like 100 years, but over 20. And finally, we have another Conservative on the panel. So I'm very excited.
Oh, and by the way, I'm a witness to when Jenni and I think when we first really met, I'm a witness to Jenni Byrne walking her talk back in 1998, March of 1998. Jenni as a young field marshal for the Conservative movement in the Reform Party by-election in what later became my riding, out here with 24 young reformers from across British Columbia and Alberta who were bussed in to save a by-election that we ultimately lost to Liberal Lou Sikora. And Jenni was all about the field organization. I can't remember how old you must have been then, but Jenni walks her talks. I was there to see I was there to see Jenni Byrne 1.0 in terms of her commitment to the ground game.
I think by-elections are when Jenni really comes alive.
No question.
It's true, and it's so sad all at the same time.
All right, Conservative team. How do we? I'm just going to start off by saying that I think that it's a good start. Like our long national nightmare of the sheer leadership is over. I think Erin O'Toole is a smart guy. I think Erin O'Toole is a personable, nice person in my interactions with him. And I think that he's going to ultimately be pretty formidable. And if you're trying to win an election after 6 years of the government being in power, you've got a chance, but it's an uphill battle. But the next one is likely the odds have shifted. So Erin O'Toole's probably going to be the prime minister of the country at some point. How are you guys feeling after? How are you feeling after the convention? Jenni,
go ahead, James. I'll let you go first.
All right.
Well, I mean, look, I think that assessment is pretty spot on. I think Erin O'Toole was a stronger candidate this time for having lost in the 2017 race. So Erin has run 2 national campaigns now. He's been a member of Parliament for some time. We forget that he actually replaced Bev Oda in his Eastern Ontario riding. So he's been in government. He's seen success within government during the Harper years. He's seen the disappointments of 2019 and the Andrew Scheer years. He understands the measure of the difference between the two. But also, he grew up around politics. His father was an MPP, of course, for a really long time. So he saw, frankly, the differences between Mike Harris and Ernie Eves and Tim Hudak and John Tory and Doug Ford. So he's seen them on the front lines in Ontario and what works and what doesn't. So he is as studied, I think, in Conservative Party internal coalition success and what that looks like and what failure looks like. And equally, I think he genuinely understands all this country because he's crisscrossed it now in 2 national leadership campaigns. And I think he aspires to win seats in all parts of the country in a way that I think is incredibly helpful. His first task, of course, will be to shore up the Conservative caucus first, then the membership, and then move forward. But I think one observation that I have that I think is useful for those who don't know internal Conservative politics is that if you look at all the caucus endorsements that Erin O'Toole had, and you look at all the caucus endorsements that Peter MacKay had, both of them actually had a broad diversity of support in terms of East-West, generational waves of Conservatives who had come into Parliament, libertarian social conservatives, traditional reformers. The Quebec caucus was split between the 2 campaigns. And so it actually shows the diversity of both the O'Toole and MacKay appeal. And so I actually think drawing them back together will be pretty simple, certainly in comparison to what Stephen Harper experienced in 2004 after the merger when he became leader, and much better than what Andrew Scheer experienced when having to deal with the struggles of Brad Trost and the apparent disagreements.
But that was part of Andrew's Andrew brought a lot of the problem on himself.
Plus Maxime, plus Kelly Leach, plus et cetera. It was actually a genuinely fractured party with a lot of internal brand issues. This time that's not going to be the case, and I think that'll bode well for Erin.
Well, and I think Erin lived through the Andrew years, and so I'm not trying to pick a fight with James on this, but the dying days of the 2019 campaign, one of the things that came out is, of course, that Andrew apparently had used party money or his leadership money to run social media campaigns against Brad Trost and Kelly Leach and Maxime Bernier. So that's the fractured party was partly because of what Andrew had done himself in terms of what happened after that leadership race. And I think that Erin, having been in caucus during that time, and just knowing Erin, he's not going to do that. People that supported the other candidates, Leslin and Leslin and Peter, I don't think they're going to have the same dynamic within caucus. And it's funny, in the last few days or 2 days since the leadership race, I've spoken to people on all camps, and it's very calm. Everyone's kind of like, there's obvious disappointment among people, especially in the MacKay camp, but it's kind of like, all right, well, it happened, and let's move on.
Is that a sign of how weakly committed they were to MacKay in the first place, that they're not that angry about the result?
I don't think so. I think it's been a long, weird leadership race, and I think people are just genuinely happy it's over. And we're actually facing, for the first time since Trudeau was elected, we're actually facing a government that is that actually has their own challenges. Like they're actually. I never thought SNC was going to end up being the silver bullet that I know a lot of people did. And the vacation on the Aga Khan Island happened within a year of his being prime minister. So it wasn't going to be a big deal. This is a big deal. Like, this is now 3 ongoing billion-dollar programs that the Liberals have announced in the last 6 months: the wage subsidy, the student grant, and the rent subsidy. Where it's kind of a friends and family deal that basically either a friend or family member of someone in the government or working for the government is benefiting from it. So I think that this is a real scandal, and the government has essentially gone unchecked for the last 6 months, because let's be honest, they did not prorogue because they genuinely wanted to reset. They've gone absolutely unchecked in terms of all of this, thanks to Jagmeet Singh, for the last 6 months. They prorogued because they wanted to stop, on our side, Pierre Poilievre, and on the NDP side, Charlie Angus and Peter Julian from asking questions of their staff and ministers and what have you about the scandalous spending. and they wanted to reset. This is Justin Trudeau wants an election as
Come on, Jenni, let's talk about the Conservative leadership race for a minute. Come on. What was surprising to you in the results? What was unexpected in the results?
I guess now I'm talking about diving into the results. What I was actually surprised at is certain things is actually how kind of weak the ground game was for both the top front runners in a province like Ontario, for example. And so, Peter won on the offset. But if you actually go into the ridings, it was actually fairly. If you look at kind of ground game stuff, and this isn't disparaging either of the campaigns, because I know they put an emphasis on ground game, but maybe they didn't for Ontario. So you have ridings, and I'm just kind of, you have ridings like Kitchener Centre. Derek Sloan won that. You have ridings like Ajax, which is in the Durham region, Erin's kind of backyard, where Erin came in third. You have ridings like my home riding of Halliburton, Kawartha Lakes, Brock, where Peter MacKay on the first ballot came in fourth. And so, you have ridings like York South-Weston, where Erin came in fourth on the first ballot. And it really wasn't until the final ballot where Erin actually really looked to do well in kind of the GTA and the heartland, that, so to speak. And so to me, that was just a little bit. It was a little bit strange. I don't think it's telling for a general election, because membership, it doesn't matter. It was just a bit weird. Also, what I found, and James I'll let him talk about the Western stuff. I was actually, basically what I heard from all the campaigns was it was going to be a blowout. MacKay was basically going to come in fourth in the West, and it was going to be an absolute embarrassment. And I heard that from some people in his campaign, whereas he somewhat held his own in Alberta, held his own in Saskatchewan, not as much. Leslin and Erin obviously were better. Won marginally in Manitoba on the first ballot, and actually won surprises in terms of, for me, what I was expecting that were different.
Let me pick up on that for a second, you guys, because I agree. It's not with MacKay, it's not necessarily a West versus East thing, and I know that BC shouldn't be included in any Western region anyway. But as I looked through it, and you'd know better, but as I scanned the riding by riding stuff, it seemed rural. It seemed like in rural Canada, whether that was in the prairies or British Columbia or Ontario, outside of Atlantic Canada, the rural ridings rejected MacKay overwhelmingly. What's that about?
I think there's a bias that Peter had against him that was a similar challenge to what Stephen Harper had back in 2004. In 2004, we forget that when the Conservative Party was first created, and we failed to be, of course, beat Paul Martin in 2004, and then we were successful in 2006. There are a lot of people in the progressive conservative movement who said that Stephen Harper comes from the reform side, and therefore he can never really appeal to us. And of course, John Herron and Scott Bryson and Rick Barotzik, all at that time progressive conservative MPs, didn't join the party, and they all left. And a lot of the base of the party never moved over. I mean, the party was so small that we managed to overcome that and move forward and so on. I think the inverse is now true for a lot of people, where in spite of Peter MacKay being a founder of the Conservative Party, in spite of him sitting loyally next to Stephen Harper for 10 years and having, an unblemished record of solidarity with Stephen Harper and our Conservative government, the longest Conservative government since Sir John A. Macdonald, in spite of all that, I think a lot of people, particularly in rural areas, they just sort of think, well, he was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. He can't possibly be a conservative, because all the real small C conservatives came over for sure in the Reform Party and maybe in the Canadian Alliance. But if you were still a progressive conservative many years later, then how can you possibly be a real small C conservative? So I think for a generation of party members, I think that holds true. And then second, and I think I suspect Jenni will agree with me on this, and I was maybe not surprised, but Peter's albatross comment in the campaign, I think, really hurt him. It's social conservatives, broadly speaking, who think that the center of public policy should be to ensure that the core institution that is associated with our personal well-being most, our health, our sense of identity, our sense of belonging, the family, should be the center focal point lens through which all public policy is assessed. Those folks don't like being told that they cost us the election, and that's why Justin Trudeau was reelected. And they understand that they're not going to win all the fights as social conservatives in every government, but they want to see the needle move in their direction. And more than all that, they want to be respected. And they don't want to be blamed for having lost when they're frankly some of the most loyal, hardworking, highest donating members of the conservative movement. And, Peter it was seen by them that Peter took a shot at them unfairly,
right,
and they got their revenge. And if you look at the 5 Western provinces, Derek Sloan and Leslyn Lewis combined, they had a plurality of the vote in all 5 Western provinces. So it speaks to, people certainly in rural parts of Western Canada looking for authentic small C conservatives, sending a message and then falling in behind Erin O'Toole on the second and third ballots.
Okay, James, can conservatives get elected in Vancouver without slapping those people down?
Sure. We won in 2011. We won some seats in Vancouver, but look, it's, the MTV, the Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver's are always tough nuts to crack. But I think conservatives have a better chance of winning in those areas, quite honestly, than Justin Trudeau has in winning in Lethbridge, Prince George, and Nanaimo. So I think we can. I think we. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think we can close that gap. I think Erin can certainly make headway there, but it's going to be a challenge. And, I'm not saying anything out of turn. This is a pretty raw podcast about, the reality of politics. But as long as Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are broken, cracked, aimless, and pointless, it's kind of, it makes it kind of a difficult challenge. However, politics is also increasingly, as you're in the first part of the show, I know was just talked about, politics is also increasingly less about left-right than it is about in and out, sort of the old, like there are a lot of people, the Donald Trump dynamic and all that, the urban elite, Ottawa elite, insider elite establishment narrative that can clearly be built around the Wee scandal and other things and SNC-Lavalin and all that. The insider-outsider dynamic is one that clearly advantages conservatives if that becomes the broad umbrella narrative over all of these scandals. And it's, I think, one that certainly can appeal to a lot of traditional blue-collar private sector union members who would vote for John Horgan in British Columbia habitually, but would not ever vote for Justin Trudeau federally, and might look to someone like Erin O'Toole and a message of outsider inclusion with a much more satisfactory outcome than we would have had with Andrew Scheer.
Can I be policy for just a second? Because I'm a liberal, so I don't know anybody who lives in rural Canada.
Well, Larry Bagnall.
What does rural Canada want? It seemed alienated even from the mainstream of the Conservative Party. It's completely alienated from the Liberal Party, obviously. But in rejecting McKay and embracing Lewis, and to a lesser extent Sloan, but let's say really embracing Lewis, there seemed to be an alienation even from the mainstream of the Conservative Party there. So what is really the mentality of rural Canada right now?
Yeah, but McKay still, I think, on the final ballot won all 3 of the Northern Territories.
Yeah, but how many votes were in those places?
Yeah, but it's still rural Canada.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean? What? I think it's simplistic to say like it's rural versus versus urban. That's exactly what you're kind of speaking into. What I think the narrative is going to be as someone that grew up in rural Canada my entire life, and and my relatives still live back there. They just actually want people to tax them less and leave them alone. And so I don't think it's any different than most people do across the country, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural.
There's a long-standing.
I don't know. I've just always felt like.
And maybe
go ahead, James.
and maybe they'd like you to leave their guns alone.
Yeah, and look, in British Columbia, and I think this is true in other parts of Western Canada as well, and also Atlantic Canada with resource-based economies there, and fishing and oil and gas, of course, more recently. But in British Columbia, it's said that 2/3 of our wealth is created outside of the Lower Mainland, but 2/3 of the people live in the Lower Mainland, and this tension between Lower Mainland and elsewhere is profound. And of course, it exists in Manitoba with Winnipeg versus other, and it exists across our resource-based regional economies. And I think certainly those who live in forest towns across British Columbia who have seen their sawmills automated and jobs lost, and we all know well the energy sector in on the prairie provinces as well. I think what they're looking for is that leaders, particularly, liberal leaders in Justin Trudeau and Bill Morneau and others who come from urban centers, Toronto and Montreal. If you look at sort of the front rank of the Liberal government, whether it's Minister Freeland, up until now, Minister Morneau, Justin Trudeau, Marc Garneau, I mean, they're all downtown Toronto and Montrealers. And I think what people from rural Canada, resource-based communities, again, they're looking for respect, and they look for, people can sense BS and insincerity 100 miles away. And they know when people are talking at them rather than talking to them after having listened to them. And people can sort through that real quick. And people in those communities, they want to make sure that their government understands their anxieties, understands their concerns, and they're nervous about their world disappearing over time and the stresses that they've seen over time. So as we, certainly in the current government, go deep down the rabbit hole of pursuing carbon pricing and carbon taxes, and carbon pricing, it's one thing to say we should have a price on carbon because of the dynamic of climate change and all that. But among the things that I think that COVID-19 and the economic collapse, I think, should have reminded all of us is that, as we know from the data out of the CERB program, that more than 40% of Canadians have less than $1,000 of cash liquidity between their standard of living and the abyss. And the CERB program and all these programs that have been there to buttress families from a complete collapse, when we just sort of say, well, we need to put a price on carbon, we need to do all these things, I think people start getting really nervous about central Canada and urban Canadians and downtown Ottawa being completely disjointed from how people who live in a circumpolar country who are going to consume a lot of energy for their jobs and for their livelihoods, that their voice is not being heard at all. They want to fight climate change, but they don't want to feel like they're the problem and they have to be take the tip of the spear in order to fight the problem.
Okay, so to go back to the race then, I've been strongly cautioned by some conservatives not to read into Leslyn Lewis's vote social conservatism, that she had social conservatives, but she had a much broader coalition than just a single issue social conservative vote for her. And so what was her appeal given what you've said about rural Canada, what was her appeal to rural Canada? I mean, in some of those prairie ridings, just going from memory, on the second ballot, she's up over 50-60%.
Well, on the second ballot, she won the plurality of the popular vote. She got 60,000 votes. Listen, I think
she was resonating.
100% she was. She and I've said this, she was a breath of fresh air. She was different, and she was not Erin, and she was not Peter. And so I think there were a large number of people that voted for her, that I know there was, that were not social conservatives, who did not really want to vote for the other two, at least on their first ballot. And then as you got further down the ballots, they picked Erin or they picked Peter in terms of who they were going to go with. But there were a number of conservatives that just felt they would have preferred a different option than those two in this race. And Leslyn gave them that option.
Right.
I think there's an authenticity around a fresh face in politics, and look, just on paper, her biography is obviously incredibly impressive, and she doesn't hit you with her biography with the letters before and after her name in a sort of a boastful way. She's sort of very Canadian about sort of her humble nature and her disposition, and then she goes on a few shows, the Sunday shows and the political shows, and she sits there and she just very dispassionately, gets the incoming fire from whatever host, and she just sort of dispassionately says, yeah, I do believe in traditional values. And well, what if there's a free vote on? And she just says, well, look, if there's a free vote on issues related to life or issues that are social conservative and conscience matters, then yeah, I think there should be a free vote. And look, I trust the Canadian people to elect members of parliament who are responsible, and I'm not worried about that. I think we should have an open dialogue in a Canadian democracy and not be afraid of Parliament having these kinds of conversations. And then taking the incoming fire and rebuttal to that and just kind of dispassionately saying, no, I think all Canadians deserve a voice. And just very calmly standing in the wind of the usual, sort of pushback against those messages. I think she was seen by a lot of people as authentic and conservative. And from what as I said in the beginning, Peter was going up against the albatross comment and his background having been a progressive conservative leader. And then Erin O'Toole, who ultimately got the Leslyn Lewis and Derek Sloan second and third ballot support. But Erin ran as a very different kind of conservative in 2017 versus Maxime Bernier and Andrew Scheer. And so I think there was a little bit of suspicion. There was comfort with Erin O'Toole, which is why those votes came to him. But I think a lot of people voted for Leslyn as a message to the party that we're looking for sincerity, we're looking to be respected, we want to be listened to, but we understand that a first-time candidate probably won't be successful, but we're sending a message that we want to be heard, and we're looking for a real, truly authentic conservative message.
Listen, I 100% I agree, and I think a lot of if you look at the breakdown, so she got 60,000 votes in the on the second ballot, and so the popular vote. But if you look at that, so 30,000 of those went to Erin, and about 10,000 went to and about 10,000 went to Peter. But 20,000 people did not, and I think those were probably and I'm sure there's going to be the number gurus will go into this, and we'll never fully know for sure. My guess is the 20,000 that did not go are the vast majority of the people that signed up just to vote for her. Like, so the non-members, the people that signed up to vote for Leslyn Lewis, my guess is they voted Leslyn Lewis on the first ballot and they didn't go anywhere else in the second.
All right. Right, interesting. So Ford immediately announces on the heels of praising the Trudeau government with language that a Liberal premier would be cautious about using to praise a federal Liberal government.
Oh, I assume.
And then immediately.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go.
Well,
I was going to say, and then immediately after the convention, he says, "I'm not going to campaign for these guys. I like the Trudeau government."
Well, and
what's going on there?
The event at the 3M where basically Trudeau or Doug introduced Trudeau, which I don't know. I can never remember a premier introducing a prime minister at an event like that. And basically said, "I love this guy. He's fantastic." And then Trudeau comes and basically just said, "Thanks, Doug. You're too kind." So the difference between Trudeau and Doug is Trudeau doesn't want to be the source of a campaign ad, and Doug is going to be front and center in Liberal ads talking about in the next election about how wonderful Justin Trudeau is. And so,
why is he doing it, Jenny?
Because he genuinely feels that way. Listen, a year ago, if Doug Ford had come out and say, "I'm not going to campaign for Andrew Scheer," there would have been I don't know, one of those gifts going, "Whew, okay, well, we don't have to worry about this now." So, we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens with this. I'm not sure it's going to mean anything other than the fact that I think that Doug will be the source of Liberal Party campaign ads. And I think that he underestimates the frustration and the anger that conservatives, especially in Ontario, are going to have with this kind of attitude, because they are different. I'm involved with both parties. There is a bit of a difference between the two, but for the most part, the people that 80% of the people that sit on the boards and doing the door knocking, they're the exact same people. And I think that those people are going to be very frustrated by that comment, whether they want Doug to actually campaign in the next election or not.
Yeah. How is, one last thing on the mechanics of this, because I just, I've been following it from the beginning. Did McKay make a mistake, or was it just not there? Was there a turning point, or was it just a gradual erosion? How did he go from the front runner to a decisive defeat? James?
I think easy to Monday morning quarterback, but I think given the nature of the swell of support for Leslyn Lewis and the aspiration for a fresh voice from the outside, I suspect it probably wasn't there for Peter because of those systemic roadblocks of his background. And look, when you're in politics, we forget he was first elected to Parliament in 1997. That's a long time ago. Mm-hmm. And so you accumulate enemies, right? And as we all know in politics, you accumulate some friends,
not me. Not me.
You accumulate enemies much faster than you. All right. So I think that's part of it, and also, and again, not to dwell too much on the on the albatross comment, but there was also the incident with John Capobianco in the middle of the campaign where people thought that if Andrew's going to lose, that Peter might run. Again, that might have been a leak. It might have been, who knows what the background story of that was, but people in the party saw that and they didn't like it. So you had people who were on Andrew Scheer who just said, who are still loyalists to Andrew and like him, they said, never will we support Peter because at our darkest moment, we needed people to rally. You have social conservatives who are suspicious. You had old-time reformers who are suspicious. And also after the campaign, sort of doing a post-mortem on the election campaign. And I think two things that Peter could have controlled that might have helped him significantly. One is, if you're thinking of running for prime minister one day, you really need to learn French and be able to speak it fluently and effectively. And so if that was at all on his radar, he should have doubled down on that in the 5 years since he left politics with me back in 2015. And he didn't do that.
For sure.
So that's number, like, if I was planning on being in a triathlon in 5 years from now, I probably might go swimming this afternoon and sort of learn the butterfly. It might be a good So he missed that. And then the second thing is, if you're looking to succeed Andrew Scheer, we all know what happened in the disappointment. Like, Andrew Scheer won the popular vote, got more seats and all that sort of stuff. But I think everybody knows that he hit a ceiling. He wasn't going to grow. He didn't have the capacity to politically build and move forward. And everybody was swirling around and the voices were coming out, and he was either going to quit or get quit or be dumped at the convention. We all kind of knew what was likely going to happen. So for Peter to add weight to that, Brutus never became Caesar. You can't be the person who participates in the assassination of the former leader and then ascend to the leadership. Because
it's certainly tricky. It's certainly tricky.
Well, we don't do it that way. Exactly. It's been done. You can ascend to the leadership, but how successful are you thereafter? Well, you can speak to that, I suppose. But I think more than anything, when that happens and you're part of that and you're part of that culture, you legitimize and weaponize that tactic against your own leadership in future years. And so it's something you just can't do. So not learning French and then being a Monday morning quarterback and poo-pooing the party as it fought Justin Trudeau, I think those were two things he could have controlled that I think really hurt him.
Jenni, I got a ground game question, which is Quebec. Okay, so I go through the Quebec results, and they look like what liberal results would be in the prairies in a leadership, and that you've got 50, 40, 50, 60 people casting ballots in those ridings.
61 people in Papineau, for example, I think is what it was.
Right, for example. So that means to me that if one of the candidates had been able to get 100 people to vote in each of the 75 Quebec ridings, so get 7,500 votes, they could have swept the province of Quebec.
Yes.
Why can't any ground organization go out and find 7,500 people in Quebec?
See, I think this is, listen, I don't know. That's, if I was running a campaign, I'd probably, that would have been a focus. I think this is the issue, I think, that ultimately came down to once the first ballot results came out, and Quebec, of course, was the last province named. As soon as those results came out, it kind of like really took the wind out of McKay's sails. It was kind of like the first ballot in 2017 when it came that, Max got about 20% in Quebec. You realize that if he wasn't going to be higher than that, there was no way he was going to be able to do it further down. On the ballot. I think what McKay's people were anticipating, and this is speculation on my part, is that they figured that Erin was going to do well in the rural area. That the Quebec gunny has now become the Quebec. It's like the former Quebec dairy farmer. It's become this new, this will be the Quebec gunny will be the new Quebec dairy farmer as we talk about this leadership race. And that McKay would basically punch above his weight in Montreal. But if you actually look in Montreal, McKay won some of the ridings, but his winning was 52 points to 41 points. It wasn't the wide swaths that the O'Toole campaign was able to do in rural Canada, and so I think or rural Quebec. So I think that's part of the there obviously wasn't the emphasis in terms of the membership sales, and you even had Derek Sloan, Leslin, and Derek actually did very well in Quebec considering their lack of ability to speak French. And Derek Sloan actually won a riding like Bourassa. And isn't that your buddy Denny Coderre's former riding?
That is exactly my friend Denny Coderre's former riding.
Yeah.
and a very nationalistic riding. I don't think that Derek Sloan as leader would carry Bourassa.
I don't think probably any conservative would carry Bourassa.
So now there's yeah.
Well, I was just going to say that the challenge that we among the challenges we do have as a party certainly is our support in Quebec that has, clearly Liberals have challenges in certain regions, Conservatives have challenges in certain regions, and when you think about official languages and the ability of a leader to parler français et communiquer avec ceux et celles qui sont francophones, that capacity of a leader to just speak French is so critically important. I mean, that's why, Pierre Poilievre was an attractive candidate in the beginning, Rona Ambrose and others is that, and Erin O'Toole is going to have to, frankly, up his game. And I know that he knows this, but when you have 78 ridings in the province of Quebec and then more than 20 ridings outside of the province of Quebec, where more than a third of the population speaks French first, if the scoreboard on election night says 85-0 in terms of seats out of 338 ridings, that doesn't include ridings like Vancouver East and Trinity Spadina and other ridings where Conservatives have a tough fight, then that means Conservatives have to sweep all the swings, all of our base, all of everything to have a shot at a minority. So, a true proper engagement with Quebec and finding those issues that resonate with Francophone Canadians is going to be critical. And so that's why, some of the cultural policy issues that were Conservatives, where we lost our majority in 2008, we're going to have to revisit that and think about that, about how we communicate and talk to the 2.5 million Canadians who speak French outside of Quebec, 2.5 million Canadians who speak French outside of the province of Quebec.
Right. In the Liberal Party, for some time now, it has just been accepted that you cannot be a candidate for the leadership if you're not bilingual.
But that's not true. That's not true. Your buddy Ken Dragon ran for leader. Hedy Fry ran for leader. Like people run for leader. It's whether they can be elected is a different thing. But don't say it's not accepted. You guys have had a ton of candidates that can't speak French.
Well,
Scott Bryson.
Yeah. Okay. That's a fair comment.
No, it's fair and accurate.
Yeah, no, that's right. 2006. That's 2006. That's right. It's a pretty rare example, though. And I just saw it. Like Brad Wall chafed about this the other day on Twitter. Said, unfortunately, it rules out a lot of people, bilingualism. But that was a reality for Ralph Goodale for his whole life, which is you're never going to be considered a potential leader of the Liberal Party as long as he didn't speak French. It's just sort of I don't know how people think. You were paraphrasing, essentially, James. You were paraphrasing Brian Mulroney in 1983. That was his pitch, as I recall, to the party in 1983, which is we are giving the Trudeau Liberals a 75-seat head start at the beginning of every election, and we need to break that. And my God, as political actors, we all know how critical communications is. I don't know why anybody would expect that you could be successful in Quebec without having somebody that was able to easily communicate with them.
Yeah, but Conservatives do understand that. Which is why, even back with Stockwell Day, when he ran against Tom Long and Preston Manning in our first leadership race as the Canadian Alliance, it was one of the distinguishing features of Stockwell Day is that he was
for sure
sufficiently base sufficiently bilingual at the time. It was a distinguishing feature in this race as well, and of Andrew Scheer. Kelly Leitch, among the reasons why she wasn't successful, didn't speak French. Brad Trost, same thing. So You look at the people who were sort of in the final running of that leadership race: Erin O'Toole, Maxime Bernier, and Andrew Scheer, all bilingual. Stephen Harper, of course, bilingual. This race, the top two finishers were people who are bilingual. They both, Peter and Erin, needed to improve their French, and Erin does still, and he knows that. But it's a distinguishing feature, and most people in the party know that that's the case. And it's not really a debate. Is it a frustrating thing? To Brad Wall's point, yeah, it is. But welcome to Canada. We are a confederation. We are a diverse country. We have a bilingual tradition of two founding languages. We have a multicultural future with a bilingual past and present and a future, and a leader who doesn't speak both languages has no chance in my lifetime of becoming the prime minister of this country. And it's an element of national unity, and it's not only. And I always make this point, so forgive me, but it's not just an ability to speak French. When you have the capacity to speak French, what you're saying to Francophone Canadians is, I can listen to you in French. We use language to communicate our emotions, our fears, our aspirations, our expectations. And when you're looking at somebody and you're looking at a politician who is supposed to be reflecting your needs back to you, if you're thinking of maybe voting for them, if you don't think that your choice of words and language and the way in which you communicate your fears and aspirations, it's not being registered with the temperament and tone in which you're expressing it, then you don't feel like your government can speak for you. Then you get into what we just talked about in the beginning about the urban-rural divide and people feeling left out. That's critical for a leader, not just to speak French so that Francophones can feel like they're being heard in their language of expression of their sentiment of the country. That's why it matters.
And that's I'm gonna go less on the the heartstring stuff that James is doing right now. In terms of a pragmatic point of view, it's not even just about Quebec or French speakers. We won a majority government in 2011 with 5 seats in Quebec. So, but the fact of the matter is that people in Ontario, whether they want to admit it or not, and whether they care personally or not about whether someone speaks French, they know that if they're going to vote for someone that's going to actually be prime minister and be able to lead this country, they have to be able to speak to Quebecers and Francophones outside of Quebec. And so it's if you look at election results in terms of voters in Ontario, and I can only speak to Ontario. I know Ontario the best. I've campaigned across the country, but it is an issue for Ontario voters that their leader speaks at least passable French, because they know how important it is for the national unity of the. And
you're right about 2011 and the 5 seats and still winning a majority. But again, keep in mind, we also won ridings like Ottawa, Orleans. We also swept New Brunswick in 2011. So those Francophone.
I agree. That was the point I was trying to make. But I'm also
Saint Boniface.
No, and we wouldn't say Boniface before 2011, but and Orleans before 2011. But my point is that it is important. I think we all agree that it's important to speak French, but it's not just in terms of speaking to Quebecers. It's a very practical thing that voters outside of Quebec that don't speak French understand the need for.
That's right.
That's right. They worry about how you could be prime minister of the whole country if you don't have that. Now in Ontario, that matters. So let's look forward now. It feels to me like the Conservatives have kind of an exciting fresh slate here from which to go. The government has prorogued the House, put in place a new finance minister, announced that it's coming back with a speech from the throne and a potential budget or economic statement that they promise to be bold and transformational.
Thank God, because it's essentially been 18 months since the last budget, but good for them.
And there was federal politics was dominated by the WE scandal before the prorogation. I presume the government is hoping that once the House reconvenes, that federal politics will be dominated by the policy issues that they've put on the table. How likely is that? Let's start, Jenny. What are you looking forward to in the fall? What's gonna be happening in Canadian politics in the next few months?
I think the Liberals are looking for some way to either have the opposition trigger election, or they're going to trigger an election themselves.
They want one this fall?
I think they want one as soon as possible.
Right.
Like the prorogation had nothing to do with like resetting. Like we haven't been sitting as a parliament for over 6 months. They had cut the deal with Jagmeet Singh and essentially committees were meeting. And they were happy with that. They were happy with that until the Finance and Ethics Committee started going after them on and uncovering all of the rot and corruption and money going into their friends and family and what have you. So that's the only reason they prorogued. The whole the fact that there's going to be a vision statement with the speech from the throne. I think that they're going to try to do things. They're going to try to hold programs like CERB hostage, and they're going to try to trigger an election before more of the corruption and scandal gets unearthed, and before the true economic consequences and the next round of job losses, which is going to happen, happen. So I think that the Liberals want an election as soon as possible. They want to have an election and then move on.
And
is that how it feels to you,
another-
James?
Well, I agree with Jenni. I think the window to do that is going to be tough because of New Democrats and the math in Parliament, and the fact that New Democrats want to be in there for as long as they can for a bunch of personal reasons, incomes and pensions and so on. But and also because they're aimless and all that. And by the way, if you think the affection affair between Doug Ford and Justin Trudeau is apparent on the surface, if you come to British Columbia, it's frankly double that with John Horgan and Justin Trudeau. So New Democrats are really out in the wilderness here. And so the idea that they would trigger a campaign this fall would be tough. I suspect they will want the Liberals to make some kind of a commitment in a fall economic update and then be really disappointed in the spring when it doesn't happen and try to refortress themselves around some idealistic thing, perhaps pharmacare or something else that is still left undone and untouched by the Liberals. So we'll see. But I agree certainly with what Jenni said. And the only other ingredient that's part of the mix that would bolster Jenni's argument as well are backbench Liberals. Who, when backbenchers start grumbling and getting anxious and getting nervous and getting frustrated about we're not being listened to, we're not being part of this, and our government seems to be aimless and pointless, and what really happened in the Weiss scandal, and you see those voices starting to creep out and leak out and get frustrated. One thing that certainly snaps them all in focus is the prospect of losing their jobs in an election campaign, and frankly missing out on their multiplier years for their pensions and ensuring that they have an opportunity to get reelected and then become a cabinet minister and do something more significant than what they've done since 2015. They will snap into focus and become disciplined soldiers real quick if they think there's a campaign in 3 to 6 months.
But the Liberals could, at the end of the day, the Liberals could go, Trudeau could go see Payette and actually pull the plug himself. And I think that what they're going to be looking at is right now there's of course an election in New Brunswick, and if you look at the ballot questions right now, so September 14th is the election, Kevin Vickers versus Blaine Higgs, and if you look at their election, where it's turned into is what's going to happen after COVID, what is going to be the economic path to recovery, and you've got Blaine Higgs talking about fiscal restraint, and you've got Kevin Vickers talking about we've got to spend our way back to prosperity. And so right now, as we still are kind of in a pandemic era where people are still worried about their jobs and their kids going back to school, now is and before, as I said, the economic ramifications of kind of all of the spending and our $1.2 trillion net debt, if not more, coming up is actually known to Canadians. I think the Liberals are going to be looking and seeing, okay, which message, if Kevin Vickers gets elected in New Brunswick, it may be a trigger for Trudeau to go to the Governor General and say, we have to have an election because it's going to be my vision versus the Conservative vision.
It's true. I actually think the most recent historic proxy for the dynamic that I think Prime Minister Trudeau would want to have emerge would be the presidential election in 2004. You'll remember, the issue of that election was continuity of leadership in a time of crisis. 9/11 happens. Afghanistan is kicked off. Iraq is happening. George W. Bush said, I have a plan. We need to fight them over there, so we're not fighting them over here. We're in the middle of it. Don't change horses in midstream. We're in the middle of it. Let's keep this going, and I have a plan. And John Kerry could try to switch it to domestic issues and talk about education and so on, but it didn't matter. The issue of the day was the fight, the anti-terrorism fight, and the war in Iraq and a war on terror. It didn't matter what John Kerry said, and he couldn't move the needle. If the issue of the second half of 2020 and the first half of 21, if the issue is vaccinations, dissemination of vaccinations, economic recovery, who is best equipped to do that? Don't change horses in midstream. The incumbent government is there. They're prepared to do it. We have a new finance minister and they're focused on it. Then the Liberals might think that might be an advantage to them, so they can not talk about we and not talk about other things. And so therefore, for this podcast and the focus on the Conservative leadership, that's why I do think it's very important that the Conservative Party think very long and hard, not just about we and the immediate scandals, and they have to do all that, and they should do all that for all the obvious reasons of public policy accountability and yes, politics. But they also need to start thinking about what their messaging is going to be, because I can tell you everyday Canadians are thinking about, are my kids safe in school? When is a vaccine coming? Are we all going to get it, and how fast? And third, how secure is my job, with 40% of Canadians having less than $1,000 of liquidity to protect them from the abyss? Who here is best equipped to protect my economic future? Those are, without question, are going to be the issues for the next couple of years. So Conservatives need to start, because if all we're talking about is we and scandals and isn't Trudeau awful and isn't he out of steam, and we don't address those bigger issues, voters are going to look right past us and think, man, you guys don't understand what's at the center of my life.
I agree. And I think part of the reason why I think the we scandal is going to hit them is we're talking about billions of dollars. So I think as we hit to the next stage of pandemic recovery, or whatever we want to call it, I think that there's going to be a ton of restructuring. And we've talked about this, James, on the podcast before, is that it's going to be restructuring of major corporations and companies. Like, so people that the actual middle class, the people making between $100,000 and $150,000 that live in the suburbs, that are living in Richmond or Surrey or White Rock in BC, and are living in Markham and Oakville and Burlington here, that a $2,000 CERB payment is not going to be able to pay their mortgage or pay their car payments or keep their kids in soccer or hockey. And I think that as this becomes a reality, which I hope it doesn't, but I think we see it in Europe, we see it in Israel, who are a few months ahead of us in terms of recovery on pandemic. If you're the Liberal Party, you're going to want to go to the polls prior to this becoming a reality, because these are the people that elected us in 2011, elected the Liberals in 2015, and kept them elected in 2019.
Oh, yeah. As a matter of the tectonic plates of politics, Jenny, you and I are in complete agreement about this. Every government's going to be in trouble because the economy is going to be bad. And that means government's in trouble. My guest this morning, Kevin Carmichael, who just finished reading Erin O'Toole's leadership platform and obviously is conversant with what the government's been talking about, said it looked to him like it was a choice between redistribution on the Liberal side and growth, economic growth and wealth creation on the Conservative side. Is that a ballot question you're comfortable with?
Well, if that's his takeaway in terms of the framework and the alternatives, then I would be very comfortable as a Conservative having that be the choice, because you can only redistribute wealth for so long when you're running, north of $250 billion deficits in perpetuity. I mean, people know instinctively that this is unsustainable. Once in a century economic measures that are not sustainable over time and can't be perpetuated forever. So the pivot is going to be, it's a challenge for the incumbent government in terms of policy, because to go from CERB to an expanded EI, or to have some kind of universal basic income,
taking money away.
For certain parts of Canadians, that's fraught with all kinds of challenges. And by the way, no matter what the Liberals may want to transition to, I promise you New Democrats will say it's not enough. I promise you that the Bloc Québécois will say they want some kind of Quebec carve-out or top-up. And that creates all kinds of economic and national unity problems as well. So for the Liberals to try to pivot to the redistribution side on a more cemented way is full of all kinds of economic and political problems. So I think the door is wide open for Conservatives to have in the most important word, a credible plan, a reasonable plan to get us moving forward with economic growth and stability. And, that it can be a lot of the things that we've rhetorically talked about, but I think we need to put more, certainly muscle and tissue on the bone, which is, issues of internal trade, international trade, lowering barriers to access to the marketplace, frankly, probably increased skilled immigrants into the country. And we get to the conversation that Brian Mulroney talks about, which is increased population over time of skilled people with lower tax rates who are contributing to economic growth. Like there are a lot of things that we can do, but I think Canadians are looking for an escape from this massive deficits, redistributionist wealth, into a hopeful message of opportunity and a forward lean.
I don't think they're looking for that right now at all. I think they're worried about paying their mortgage, and they're worried they're going to lose their job.
For sure.
No,
but as a framed conversation a year from now.
But at the end of the day, I agree with everything James said. Like, intellectually, I agree with everything, but that's not what Canadians are looking for now. And that's going to be the challenge that the Conservative Party has, because it goes back to, let's see if it's Blaine Higgs, let's see if it's Kevin Vickers. But if we think that if there is a snap election in the fall, that we are going to win the hearts and minds based on international trade barriers and upping the population on skilled workers. Like we're living in Technicolor. We're going to get our asses handed to us, because right now all the liberals need is 10 seats, whether it's from us or whether it's from the NDP or whether they take a few from the bloc. And so I think that that might be the campaign plan for the next election, but I think we have to have a more practical plan leading into whether it's this fall or whether it's this spring. But I think at the very least, it's going to be the spring. The liberals are going to want to go as soon as possible.
I don't. By the way, I don't disagree with you, Jenni, but I'm talking about long term, as Kevin framed the choice between the two parties. We are not going to out liberal liberals when it comes to deficit spending and all that. And so in the long term, we need to reframe ourselves, which is why I emphasize the word credible. We need to be credible. But in the immediate term, yeah, of course. I mean, this is why I think the Conservative caucus in Ottawa hasn't been overly aggressive in focusing on deficit numbers, because that's not what Canadians want to hear. They want to hear some kind of immediate plan to support people through this crisis. I mean, I get it. We all have people in our families and extended families who are anxious about this. So I totally agree with you on that. But I think as a longer term framing and a pivot out of this, assuming that we will have a vaccine and we will be moving forward, I think a fresh new message of optimism about growth that is sustainable and realistic is something that Conservatives can absolutely put in the window in the long term. But I also think tactically, to Jenni's point as well, I think that's why Conservatives do need to be very careful about the WE scandal, and if they are seen as being obstructionist and giving the Liberals an argument that they're basically shutting down and making Parliament completely dysfunctional for the incumbent government to manage getting CERB payments to families who are struggling or dealing with the pandemic in any way, if they're seen to be excessively focused on the WE scandal in a way that obstructs people from getting their paychecks, I think that could hurt the Conservative message of putting the public ahead of scoring points on the WE scandal, even though they still have to do it. But it's a delicate dance of being seen as being obsessed about WE to the detriment of everyday Canadian families who are really worried about their future.
So I think in my polling, I'm seeing things that support everything everybody's been saying. So first of all, people remain very fearful of COVID. If anything, concerns about a second wave and the possibility of somebody in your family getting it are elevated from what they were in April or May. So those concerns are not dissipating, except among the youngest age cohort of the population, where they're much weaker. But among most other people, they're not dissipating. Point number one. Point number two is people are getting increasingly concerned about the viability of their job and their ability to earn an income over time. The third thing is that people have seen social fissures in society that have made them uncomfortable, whether that is racism, whether that is poverty, whether that is inequality. Different people have different priorities, but the COVID's also made people more activist on some levels. And the fourth thing is that I'm seeing hugely elevated concerns about debts and deficits among the population. So while I have been pretty public for years about the fact that debt and deficits have become a lower order concern for people, people have not inculcated this new math about how debts and deficits are free because the money's free and we don't have to pay any interest. They're still looking at those numbers that are coming out and saying, by any standard that I have to assess this is a shocking number. And by everything I've been told over the course of my life, this is a big problem. So in that mix is where the policy sweet spot is. And I guess if I was advising the Trudeau government, I would tell them, do not discount the concerns about debts and deficits. If there's something that I learned with Premier Wynne, and this is a mistake I'll take personally on myself, that while it is true that voters did not want us to be obsessed about the debt and deficit, nor were they prepared to believe that we were cavalier about it. And once they came to believe that we were cavalier about it, we were in a lot of trouble with our own voter base. So if that's something I think the Trudeau Liberals have to bear in mind, my question for you two would be, is there any merit and or interest in the Conservative Party taking on a social issue, something that is perceived to be a failure of our society in the way that since abject poverty is or rising inequality might be, and add that to the arsenal add that to the arsenal of fiscal responsibility and of growth. Is there any interest in the party in trying to tap into the sense also that, I hate this term, build back better. But what do you think about that?
Go ahead, Jenni.
I think there's always an interest. This actually is. It's interesting that you say that the 4 points that you talked about people becoming more activist and what have you. And I think that's a great thing. I think probably that's the one, one of the things of COVID is people are paying more attention to what's happening, and then they're concerned about COVID. But it also goes into, there's probably the people that are concerned, that are social activists that are concerned about social inequality are also the same people that were pounding on the poor kids that were out in Trinity Bellwoods on just before the May 2-4 weekend, who were having a beer, sitting and trying to get outside because they can't afford to have a big backyard and a Muskoka cottage or a Kawartha cottage or what have you. So I think that it's going to be interesting. It's the social inequality is not I think in terms of the typical what people think it is. It's not inner city versus suburbs versus what have you. It's COVID has actually exposed that it's the social inequality are people that you would assume that are actually doing well. And so I think it will, but that goes to your debt and deficit. This is going to affect everyone, but in varied degrees as to how it's going to affect them. So yes, I think it's going to be something that conservatives should be looking at, but it's not going to be in the traditional sense that I think people are thinking of.
Okay.
I think as you laid out the public opinion research, the sequence that you had, I think, is actually exactly right, which is health, their job and opportunity, their sense of community, and then fourth is the debt and deficit and the fiscal framework of the country and what that means, and in terms of a long-term impact on their kids and their taxes and their opportunities. I think that's, as we sit here right now, I think that is the correct order of people's anxieties. But I think it's true to observe as well that will not always be the same order of things. And so that's why I think conservatives establishing credibility in the immediate issues and then having long-term credibility on the third and fourth issues as those emerge as the more dominant issues in 6 months' time or a year's time, I think is going to be critical. And I think it's a sort of an intellectual advantage that conservatives have. I mean, politics, center-left parties have sort of a built-in advantage with voters. Voters assume that a center-left party will be better at redistributionist economics. They'll be better at healthcare and social issues. They might be better at sort of the softer social side. But they also assume that a center-right party will probably be better at foreign policy, better at trade, better at economics, better on justice issues. So in my view, politics is not about, as a center-right party, trying to convince the public that, you're actually better than the liberals on the environment. No, you have to be credible on those issues. The challenge of politics is to make the campaign about the issues about which you, by instinct, have an advantage with voters. People trust center-right parties with the economy. They trust center-right governments with foreign policy. They trust center-right governments with justice issues. And so if you can make the campaign less about trying to convince people that you're not what you are, and that focus people on, you are what you think we are, and we're actually really good at it. And by the way, these are the issues that we need to be focusing on. That gives you an instinctive advantage with the bias that people instinctively have within them about what a center-right and a center-left party are best at.
I agree. I 100% agree. And not to go back into the politics stuff, but in terms of your ranking, to James's point, that right now it's health, economy, debt, what have you. In 6 months, if people lose their jobs, health actually becomes secondary. They care more about the immediate economic job type question, which goes back to not trying to turn to politically. That's the liberals are going to want to have an election while health is still top of mind to people and not the economy and their jobs.
Okay. And Jenni, what role does the WE scandal play in this going forward?
I think what it plays, other than the obvious, is that as it becomes more apparent as to what the government was trying to do, I think as people are worried about the economy and they're worried about paying their bills, they're now seeing that this is a millionaire celebrity prime minister and at the time a multimillionaire finance minister, who were giving multi-millions of dollars to their friends and family through, we paying their family a $1 billion program to administer that they actually didn't have the capabilities to administer. This is the whole crux of things. Anyone that's been in government knows that there is no way this would have made it up. James was a cabinet minister. There was no way, if this had all of a sudden been table dropped in our government as like a policy, people would have been like, what the fuck is this? Like, it never would have, it literally would have been laughed out of the cabinet room. And so as people's livelihood, I think it is part of the scandal, but it's going to to the crux that this is a government that in the middle of a pandemic was thinking about how they can reward their friends and give them millions and millions of dollars. That was their priority over actually protecting Canadians and making sure that Canadians got through the pandemic. That is
okay. So I would argue to you that message has already been sunk. That argument's already been won. That if the Trudeau government wins this fight, it will have been a technical win, and that in terms of public opinion, people have basically accepted that what you've said is true. So that's now already baked in.
Oh, so conservatives shouldn't talk about it anymore. Okay, well, it's baked in. So
no, I'm not suggesting that. I'm not saying you shouldn't be talking about it anymore. I'm saying that what advances it.
Well, the worst. I would say the worst sort of scandals are ones that reinforce the negative pre-existing perceptions of what the Liberals are in their worst iteration, or what the Conservatives are in their worst iteration. I just talked a second ago about, the instinctive bias that people have towards center-left and center-right parties, but people also have sort of a meme built in their mind of what's the worst iteration of what a Conservative would look like, where this brooding and mean and heartless and whatever. Well, there's a Liberal one which is friends helping friends, greasy insiders who are besties who table drop, $500 million programs that they administer, and families of friends kind of get a little taste of the money too. Like that is the worst meme and the worst iteration of it. People forget as well that it's not just the We scandal, right? It's We on top of SNC Lavalin, on top of the vacation with the Aga Khan. Like there's a continuity here of common denominator, which reinforces the worst iteration meme of what liberal, ugly liberal looks like. And there, by the way, there is a conservative one, as I said, but it is. And we also forget, lesson from history, that the sponsorship scandal wasn't just a sponsorship scandal. That also came after the $1 billion HRSDC scandal, that came after the $1 billion long gun registry. So the argument of fiscal irresponsibility or government mismanagement and corruption, so there was a continuity of argument. So this is at least the third in a string of similar issues that reinforce that meme of what the worst iteration of a liberal looks like. And I think that's what does damage. It's not We on its own. And there comes a tipping point where a government just can't recover. And is this it? I don't know. But I think it absolutely accelerates and weaponizes the argument.
Well, having spent years worried that I was the worst iteration of a liberal, I'm glad to hear somebody else is. And James, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun. You're super insightful. I want to talk more politics over a beer with you at some point. I really enjoyed this. And everybody, enjoy James Moore. Next week, we'll have another celebrity guest of some kind. And then the show after Labor Day features the return of Scott Reed. So after Labor Day, Scott Reed is back on the panel and presumably well-trained for the beatings and whoopings that Jenny is going to lay on him when he gets back here. Anyway, I had a great time today. James, you got up super early and you were super great. Thanks for doing it, Jenny. I love you as always. My shirt says, God only knows what I'd be without you. All right, if you like the show, give us a shout out on social media or go to iTunes and give us a review or a rating, and we will be back next week with more politics. Thanks for listening.
Herle Burly.